me very, it is very excited to be doing these types of teasers and also to meet your current students. So thanks a lot for this. What I thought I'm going to give you today is a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing in the summer school. So that's the left side of the screen. My part of the summer school is going to be looking at our concepts, ESG, corporate governance, and sustainability in an Asian context. We're going to be looking at what these conceptualizations mean in very short globally, and then we're going to be delving into what and how they are conceptualized in the region before going into case studies. These case studies can be a bit of a country studies where we're looking at one specific country, or we are looking at a topic that has got regional implications, and then we're going to be discussing a bit on different countries. For today, so that you get an idea of what these things might look like, I decided we're going to be focusing on corporate social responsibility. So you're going to get a brief introduction to corporate social responsibility, probably more like a recapturing of what you've already done and known. We then look at what this construct corporate social responsibility means in Asia and whether we do have a regional response to corporate social responsibility before we're going to have a look at country studies. So I've picked Malaysia because it's one of my most favorite countries, and looking there at Malaysia and corporate social responsibility with 3 case studies on philanthropical aspects of corporate social responsibility, environment, and corporate governance. So as you can see, it gives you a bit of an insight also what you might expect in the Bayreuth summer school, but it's also a great overview so that you know how corporate social responsibility in general evolved in Asia and particularly what it means in Malaysia. So when you're looking at corporate social responsibility in general, there are different ways of looking at this. The one on the right-hand side, you have a bit of a timeline on how corporate social responsibility evolved in the West. The first impetus on corporate social responsibility was in fact what you might want to call corporate social trusteeship or stewardship, which was predominantly practiced in the 1950s and 1960s. You might want to call it also more of a corporate philanthropy because it was really driven by the conscience of the executive, by the director, by the owners of businesses, and they were focusing on their company image and the public relationship that corporate social responsibility might give them. So it was about company grants, charitable foundation grants, etc., that they were focusing on. So it was really a business focus on corporate social responsibility driven by certain businesses. And the next phase of corporate social responsibility was corporate social responsiveness. So 1960s to about the 1970s. And this was corporate social responsibility that was responding to social demands. So it was responding to issues of peace protests, gender equality, racial discrimination, and it was focusing on the social impact, raising awareness that was coming out of these businesses. The driver was really depending on what type of business we are talking about. If it was a labor-intensive business, they were mostly focusing on workplace discrimination and labor conditions. If it was a high-risk environmental aspects, so they were looking at, for instance, mining and construction. They were looking particularly at issues of health and safety concerns. As such, corporate social responsibility really was a strategic response to the needs of the public that was undertaken by the businesses. The third phase, 1980s to 1990s, was focusing on corporate business ethics. Here it was about whether the company had something like an ethical corporate culture. Were they taking human rights, social justice, and community welfare into account, and of course environmental protection. Here it was again going back more towards the business as a driver rather than the public as such. The 1990s to 2000 was where corporate social responsibility was in itself becoming really global, because that's the phase where it was about corporate global citizenship. So we are talking about government taking interest, but also intergovernmental compacts and international organization coming in as well. So it was about cross-cultural, cross-national, cross-governmental, cross-regional aspects and in scope. So it means that we were seeing this global network of corporate social responsibility really emerging. The following phase, phase 5, is the millennium future. So this is where we're talking about integrating culture and nature, corporate and planetary responsibilities. So it is focusing more about, again, on international aspects of corporate social responsibility, but answering global issues in a global manner. If you're looking now at how the literature evolved on corporate social responsibility, they were taking those different phases into consideration. So in general, you can say that CSR in the literature is often understood as a voluntary commitment to certain company rules. That means they are beyond state laws and governmental standards. They are assuming that companies are supposed to operate responsibly and morally, and that CR does have a certain aspects of public image. So quite often you hear that CSR does have more or less of a PR purpose as well. So this has caused quite a lot of criticism in regards to corporate social responsibility, whether companies are really doing it for the public good or whether they are doing it in order to look good in the public eyes. And we're going to come back on this idea as well later on in our case study in Malaysia. So don't forget about that. So for our purpose, I quite like Carroll's 4-part definition of corporate social responsibility. And these are different aspects of corporate social responsibility. So it can have a bit of a philanthropic aspect. That means you are assuming you are doing this. The motivation for doing corporate social responsibility is that you want to be a good corporate citizen. Ethical responsibility is similar to this one, except that here you're asking yourself what you're doing has to be right, fair, and just. So it's not about only giving back, but it's about doing what is right, fair, just, ethical. Legal responsibility is quite often overlooked, and we're going to be discussing legal requirements of CSR in Asia and particularly in Malaysia. because this is coming from the idea that, yes, you do have to obey the laws and adhere to regulations. So this is where corporate social responsibility has been embedded in frameworks, whether they are soft standard or whether they are already hard law. And of course, economic responsibilities. This is where you are assuming you're doing corporate social responsibility in order to be profitable, to maximize sales, and to minimize costs. So these are, as I said, 4 cornerstones, and we're going to see in the Malaysian case study what those cornerstones mean for certain initiatives in corporate social responsibility. So you might want to take a screenshot and keep that in mind. So, corporate social responsibility. The question we have to ask ourselves now, when we have this global norm, and what I've described beforehand was really the development in the West. So questions that are arising is, do we have a Western construct that is doing a global success story? We have these ideas quite often when it comes to law and development, when it comes to legal transplants theory, etc. And I quite like looking at norms this way, looking at where do they originate from and how are they developing in their, when they are making their way around the globe. The framework I'm suggesting here is not one of law and development as such, and it's not of legal transfer, even though you might get with a couple of the norms when you're coming to the summer school, we will be talking about these theories as well. But here I would be suggesting looking at a story of convergence or divergence. This is what happens to norms. Are they becoming more similar or more different when we are having these global stories? And the reason why I'm looking at convergence or divergence of norms is that other civilizations have also histories of elements of corporate social responsibilities where they're picking up on certain elements such as ethical responsibility, philanthropy responsibility, also economic responsibility. So for instance, in Asia, we do have China's harmonious society construct. Malaysia's 2020 vision is building on these ideas. Singapore's tripartite approach or Thailand's sufficiency economy all are championing the cause of economic development that goes hand in hand with sustainable social development and setting standards for responsible business behavior. So the question is really, when those norms are meeting more or less in mind, what happens to them? Do we have a convergence or divergence? A convergence basically means that there's a tendency of societies to grow more alike, to develop similarities in structures, processes, and performances. Convergence can occur as a formal convergence. That means when domestic legislation is altered to correspond to a global template. For instance, when we are talking about global standards on corporate social responsibility, right? You might also have functional convergence that occurs when underlying regulatory practices in recipient countries come to resemble global norms and standards. So this is more the area when we are not having hard law, but we might have something like business standards that have a regional response. Or we might have something like hybrid convergence, which is a dynamic process that selects cultural values and institutions that are redefined and innovated when they are meeting. So as you can see, there are a lot of opportunities and possibilities. We also might have cases of divergence when legal systems and expectations are growing apart. So we're going to see, and it's not one answer fits all, but you might have a formal convergence in some cases, while you might have a hybrid convergence in other cases. And it's really interesting to see what and why they are occurring and so differently responding to this one norm. Any questions on that? I don't see any hands up, okay. So let's take the components of corporate social responsibility and pick them apart. So if you're looking, and there are different ways of looking what corporate social responsibilities means, I thought I'm focusing on 3 things. They are in fact not nearly as neatly divided as you see in the second graphic on the right-hand side, which is why I like the left-hand side, but I thought it's going to be much messier for you to pick up the different words and the different key concepts that I've put into that graphic. So it is probably a mix of both of them. So when you're looking at the components of corporate social responsibility, you can, on the one hand, look at activities. So you can say, okay, what are they doing? And they might do philanthropical activities that quite often respond to a public image. That means there's certain social pressure for philanthropic approaches and to implement corporate social responsibilities ideas. Bear that in mind when it comes to the Malaysian case studies. You might have activities that are part of legal compliance. So for instance, these are the international standards or even the Asian standards. So international standards, we do have some who are taking aspects of corporate social responsibility into account. We have ISO 26000. This is a standard that was published in 2010 and was developed, of course, by the International Standard Organization in order to guide organizations on how to implement corporate social responsibility. It is a non-certifiable standard, but it is a guide that is a result from a consensus among international experts representing main stakeholders and designed to encourage and promote the implementation of social responsibility best practices internationally. We have standard SA 8000. This is a voluntary management standard developed by the Social Accountability International of the United Nations and was published in 1997. And it's referring to working conditions and an independent control system for the ethical production of goods and services, as well as suitable working conditions. So it focuses on different conventions of the International Labour Organization, the Declaration of Human Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also have AA 1000, which comes from the UK and was developed in 1999 by Accountability with the goal of integrating management, auditing, and communication into CSR aspects. Its main feature is that it is on the development of an elaborate methodology that begins with the identification of the demands of stakeholders and is followed by a redefinition of different values. In general, we do have over 200 CSR rules or principles that are floating around internationally. So that is quite a substantial amount of rules that are requiring this type of legal compliance. Activities also include self-regulation. So these are international standards, for instance, which are soft law. For that, we have the UN Draft Code of Conduct on Transnational Corporations in 1974. We do have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that passes recommendation by governments to multinational enterprises operating in or from adhering countries, and over 300 complaints are addressed through its grievance mechanism. We do have, of course, the UN Global Compact, which was launched in 2005, which calls on companies to voluntarily embrace and enact a set of principles relating to human rights, labor rights, environment, anti-corruption, and 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labor standards, environment, and anti-corruption. There are, however, no mechanisms for holding companies to account for human rights violations, different to our OECD guidelines, which does have a grievance mechanism. We have activities that are based on new business models, so that where businesses are responding to social needs and private provision of public goods, social enterprises, green tech, and others. So these are the activities. Influences on corporate social responsibility. Culture and religion does have an influence on corporate social responsibility, because different cultures have a bearing on the practice and the perception of corporate social responsibility. The study by Ringhoff and Solov in 2007 stated that the emergent picture is one of a moderate yet important role of cultural specificity in determining the behavior of corporations towards social and environmental concerns. So we're going to be looking at culture and religion in particularly in one of our case studies today in Malaysia. We have, of course, state capacity as an influence. When we're talking about legal compliance, self-regulation of businesses, we have to bear in mind how much of a regulatory framework can a state provide to enable an economic environment and physical infrastructure for the corporations to be enacting corporate social responsibility. Are they in a position to make it not only a soft law, but are they passing laws that make it necessary for them to be complying with corporate social responsibilities? Again, we're going to be seeing cases of this in Malaysia when we're talking about Islamic banking and finance, or when we're talking about initiatives by the Malaysian Stock Exchange, which make it compulsory for companies to be enacting certain aspects and reporting certain aspects on corporate social responsibilities. We do have, of course, influences by the global supply chains. So these are the responses when we are remembering our phase 4 and 5 of corporate social responsibility, when it was about the international dimension of it. So of course we do have a global supply chain that is making it necessary for businesses to be looking and implementing corporate social responsibilities. We're going to be looking at the issue of the palm oil production in Malaysia as an example for this in our case studies. You do have then unique factors, and you will see that the factors are basically flowing from the influences I've discussed earlier. So state regulations, for instance, policies. If we have states that are not big on regulating, but are more managing through policies. We have the society that you can split up into the informed consumer or the civil society that is providing a big impetus on how corporate social responsibility should be evolving and what things should be taken into account. So when we are looking at regional responses, and there we can see that, of course, culture, state, policies, etc., are playing a factor in regional responses as well. So in Asia, we have initiatives, for instance, by ASEAN. And in 2008, ASEAN partnered with the Institution of Management, AIM, to implement the Network of Asian Corporate Foundations project. So that project is looking at a regional network for CSR in order to develop CSR in the region and to have a more harmonized response to corporate social responsibility. And it's only harmonized, not a unified response, because when it comes to Asian initiatives, you have to take into account that ASEAN in itself is very much aware and very much limited by its approach on state sovereignty and respect for differences in culture. So ASEAN is hardly suggesting a unified approach to anything, but it is really finding a common denominator among the countries in which they can agree on. So we have in December 2010, the ASEAN CSR Network, ACN, was established with support from the ASEAN Foundation and the Japan ASEAN Solidarity Fund. It developed a blueprint on promoting corporate social responsibility that was signed by all of the ASEAN heads of state, and that identified as an integral strategy in ensuring sustainable and inclusive social economic development in ASEAN. ACN was inaugurated then in 2011, and it is a platform for networking and cooperation at the ASEAN level. It supports capacity building, training activities, helps to rally collective action on key issues, etc. But it is a soft approach to CSR. Not last year, because it was 2019, so it was the year before. So 2 years ago, we had the ASEAN Responsible and Inclusive Business Alliance, ARIBA, being established. And this is, again, a regional network, at this time of businesses, that promotes responsible, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable enterprises. As we can see in those regional approaches, we will not have hard law there. We do only have networks, exchange of ideas, etc., when it comes to corporate social responsibility. So let's look at Malaysia. Now, about a decade ago, the deputy finance minister said local companies, both public and private, have not fared well compared with their British and Australian counterparts in terms of being socially and environmentally friendly. The question we have to ask ourselves, and with the fact that Malaysia's Vision 2020 has now passed, because we are in 21, it is time to take stock and see how far have they come and how far are they going to go. And it is a pretty mixed bag when it comes to corporate social responsibility, if I may say so, that in advance. So, timeline for corporate social responsibility. In the 1960s, we do have Islamic economic activities, and I've picked them up because those Islamic economic activities per se have certain elements of corporate social responsibility in it. The idea is in Islamic economy that you are not active as a business or even as an individual just in order to gain profit. Wealth in Islamic thought always has a social responsibility attached to it. So it's not about maximizing your own economic profit, but it is about giving back to society, also adhering to certain rules in Islamic thought, for instance, that you are not allowed to partake in certain economic activities that are deemed prohibited. We then had, and this is basically the cornerstone of corporate social responsibility, the Malaysia 2020 vision. Which was developed in the 1990s by then Prime Minister Mahathir. And in 1991, Malaysia set itself the goal to become a developed economy by 2020. And this economic development was supposed to go hand in hand with ideas of corporate social responsibility. Mahathir said, by the year 2020, Malaysia can be a united nation with a confident Malaysian society infused by strong moral and ethic values, living in a society that is democratic, liberal and tolerant, caring, economically just and equitable, progressive and prosperous, and in full possession of an economy that is competitive, dynamic, robust, and resilient. So the key words for us is a strong moral and ethical values, and living in a society that is economically just and equitable. These are...
Ich bin nur in einem Zoom-Meeting wieder mal von der Uni Bayreuth. Ist ja nicht so schlimm, ich schalte das sowieso ab. Und ich habe so ein schönes Bild über den.
I think that was not meant to turn on, right? Okay, I just ignore it. Then we have the role of corporate governance and how it is feeding back into Malaysia's 2020 vision and into ideas of corporate governance. So following the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, the government established the Finance Committee on Corporate Governance, compromising both government and industry. The idea was that Malaysia really had to get its act together on corporate governance reform, because one of the biggest drivers of the Asian financial crisis for Malaysia was its lack of a corporate governance reform. We will see that this issue has been ongoing because it is one of the biggest factors in the IMDB scandal that rocked Malaysia the past 8 years as well. We had significant financial sector reform that was playing into corporate social responsibility, in particularly in the roles of the security commissions and the Malaysian Stock Exchange, who undertook a whole number of initiatives focusing on corporate social responsibility. For instance, the Malaysian Stock Exchange in 2006 mandated disclosure on corporate governance practices of listed companies. It launched its silver book for government-linked companies, which we are going to be looking in detail later on. In 2007, it required disclosure of 4 main focal areas of corporate social responsibility practice, as such as environment, workplace, community, and marketplace. In 2008, it authored a study on CSR in Asia and where Malaysia is lacking behind and where it should be taking more steps. In 2010, it launched an environmental, social, and corporate governance ESG index, which was then implemented in 2012, focusing on corporate social responsibilities. And in 2019, the Malaysian Stock Exchange mandated it compulsory for listed companies to be reporting on corporate social responsibilities. Apart from these government institutions, we do have also businesses initiatives such as the 2009 local network, which is basically a localized idea of the Global Compact initiative by the UNDP. We also have an Institute for Corporate Social Responsibilities launched in 2015, which developed a new sustainability framework and a new sustainability reporting guide and toolkit in order to improve business transparencies on environmental, social, and corporate governance related issues. So as you can see, there are a lot of different actors and feeders into the development of corporate social responsibility in Malaysia. If we are taking the Silver Book guidelines developed by the Malaysian Stock Exchange and their 4 pillars, it is focusing on environment, community, marketplace, and the workplace. And I thought I'm going to give you a teaser of 3 case studies picking up on certain aspects of the Silver Book guidelines and how businesses have been implementing this. So the first one is one of my favorite topics, and we're going to be getting much more detail in the summer school on this one, because I think it is something that most people are not necessarily aware of, and that it's the most interesting one if you want to know how different cultures and different religions are conceptualizing corporate social responsibility. So this one is the one on philanthropy and Islam. It is a story of diffusion of corporate social responsibility with Islamic concepts of Zakat. Now, Malaysia is a Muslim majority, and Islam does have a special position in its framework, and as such we do have frameworks, legal frameworks that are picking up specifically for Islamic activities. So for us, for instance, we do have a complete Islamic economy, or a halal economy operating in Malaysia, which is ensuring that everything that is done is according to Islamic principles and Islamic law. Now, one of the main components of Islam is, for an individual, the 5 pillars of Islam. That is that you have to declare your faith, you have to pray, you have to give zakat or alms and fasting during the month of Ramadan, and of course the pilgrimage to Mecca. And if we are looking at the 3rd pillar, this is the giving of zakat and alms, what we have is a really interesting hybrid conversion. This is where elements of corporate social responsibility are adopted to local environments and are merging with local factors as well. So you see this happening in the area of Zakat. Zakat is, as I said, it's similar to alms giving. It assumes that an individual has to pay a certain amount 2.3 kilogram of rice that is then distributed among certain benefactors. And it also assumes that an individual has to pay a certain percentage of their wealth to these individuals. And the interesting part is, because of the development of the Islamic financial sector, we do have certain areas, particularly the Islamic banking and finance sector, are required to pay zakat. Now, going back to our Carroll's approach and how corporate social responsibility can be conceptualized, there are different ways on how you can pay this zakat. And it's really interesting. We do have, for instance, zakat collection centers who are paying zakat as well. And for them, back then, that was not legally required. For them, it was basically an ethical component. Well, it was unthinkable for them not to be paying zakat themselves. Interestingly enough, zakat is for an individual, a person, but here a business entity decided to take up this responsibility. We do have, for instance, Islamic banking and finance who are required to pay zakat based on laws. So here we have clear legal compliance requirement. And there it is really interesting on how this legal compliance is then well, practiced or implemented, because the legal compliance of paying zakat did not give any way that you have to pay it in a certain way. So for an Islamic bank or finance institution has to pay zakat, but whether they are paying it to the zakat collection centers such as the PPZ, or if they are setting up their own corporate social responsibility programs with zakat, is left to their own device. So legal compliance, yes, but with a multitude of different ways of implementing and fulfilling these legal compliance. We do have, for instance, also non-compliance with this idea of business zakat. And interestingly enough, this is Petronas, which is an oil and gas company and wholly owned and operated by the government. So it's arguably the largest Muslim business organization in Malaysia, but they don't pay zakat. Instead, they are referring to their comprehensive corporate social responsibility program and are saying, well, we are doing a lot in corporate social responsibility, which means we do not have to look after zakat as such. So really interesting development there on how corporate social responsibility merged with zakat and how it's then being implemented and practiced by those different businesses. I flagged the palm oil industry as an example of the global supply chain, local business and environmental case study. Palm oil is the most consumed and most widely traded vegetable oil in the world. You find it in nearly all of your everyday goods on the supermarket shelves, from lipstick to ice cream, etc. And Indonesia and Malaysia produce about 80% of the palm oil production in the world. So it would be a perfect example to look at a regional response as well. Now, Malaysia used to be the biggest palm oil producer, but it was overtaken recently by Indonesia as well. It is still one of the largest economic factor in Malaysia in itself, and it has been causing serious problem in regards to the production of palm oil. Issues in the palm oil industry are labor standards, are child labor, are deforestation and the environment, etc. So to give you an idea of the global impact of this one, if you're only looking at aspects of the environment and the deforestation of areas for palm oil production, in April 2007, the European Parliament passed an overwhelming margin a non-binding resolution calling for the establishment of a single certified sustainable palm oil scheme. So that would ensure that only oil from palm grown in an environmental sustainable manner will be allowed entry into the EU after 2020. The resolution also suggested that palm oil should be phased out for the European biodiesel program. In 2080, a study requested by the European Commission concluded that palm oil cultivation resulted in excessive deforestation. In 2019, the EC decided that its use in transport fuel should be reduced as of 2023 and phased out by 2030. Now, Malaysia had, of course, a scathing response to this, Mahathir alleging that the European Union is at risk of starting a trade war with Malaysia regarding its grossly unfair policies geared towards decreasing the use of palm oil, which Mahathir stated was unfair and an example of rich people try to impoverish poor people. And this year, Malaysia is seeking consultations under the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement mechanism on the EU measurements in regards to palm oil and sustainability. Now, labor standard last year, December 2020, the United States Custom and Border Protection issued a withhold release order banning the importation of palm oil in the United States production by Sime Darby, which is one of the major palm oil producers and businesses in Malaysia, following an investigation into into forced labor on Simdami-owned plantations. So as you can see, the palm oil industry is a clear example of where global pressure, global supply chain requests and demands are forcing national responses and looking at how things can be done differently. The last example is on corporate governance, and particularly corporate governance in government-linked companies. Now, one IMDB was the financial or the institution for economic development in Malaysia, and it is a classical success, rags to riches, bags to rags story. It was established in 2018 as a sovereign wealth fund and was then nationalized to benefit all Malaysians. It was focusing on strategic investments such as real estate, tourism, infrastructure, and energy. The problem was basically with its governance structure. It had a board of directors and that was completely subservient to the chairman of the advisory board, which happened to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia. It had significant issues in regards to its internal and external auditing, and it ended up being a global national investigation into its practices on how it was operating and whether it did have any checks and balances in place. And I'm keeping a story really short that has been following me for the last 7, 8 years I've been working on this one. National investigations were completely stifled initially. It had a massive political fallout with auditor generals being replaced, ministers stepping down, etc. But the national investigation was stifled from the top down. Meanwhile, international investigations were gearing up with Swiss banks losing their license, banks and finance organizations, for instance, losing their licenses in the wake of the scandal, Singapore taking actions, United States taking actions, etc. It changed nationally only in 2018 when we had the general election and we had the change in government. And what a change it was, because the former prime minister was charged in relation to the IMDB scandal, and he was convicted to 12 years in jail in 2020 for abuse of power and 10 years in jail for each of the 6 counts of money laundering and breach of trust. The IMDB scandal is a perfect example showcasing on what corporate governance reforms were done in Malaysia, where they were falling short, why they are falling short, and why nothing is going to be changing in the near future on this. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you a very, very broad overview snapshot of some of the issues regarding corporate social responsibility in Asia. Regional, national in regards to Malaysia, questions of convergence and divergence. So you see, for instance, we had forms of convergence occurring when it came to Zakat particularly, and it was interesting to see how norms are emerging by mixing them basically together, and what it means then for Zakat and corporate social responsibility if you put them together, stir the pot and see what's happening then. You can see that global pressure is bringing local acceptance to a certain degree in the palm oil industry, where we have a form of formal convergence. We have global pressure resulting in change in norms in the area of corporate governance, but those are not implementing and applied accordingly. So we have different examples of how this corporate social responsibility is accepted and modified and changed in the Malaysian context. For the summer school, you're going to get this in much more detail, and we are not only going to be looking at Malaysia, but Indonesia, Singapore, maybe a bit of the Philippines and China as well, depending also on your interests and these kinds of things. So thank you so much for your attention, and I throw the floor open for questions.